Ik verwelkom jullie graag naar Amerikaanse filosoof Kate Kirkpatrick. Zij zit hier ook in de meeting normaal gezien al. Kate is gespecialiseerd in het Franse existentialisme en doceert aan de faculteit filosofie op Oxford University. Waarschijnlijk zijn er onder jullie wel een aantal die, net als ik, haar biografie over Simone de Beauvoir hebben gelezen. Maar deze kreeg ook wereldwijd lovende recensies. En hoewel het boek pas verschenen is in 2019, dus pas vorig jaar verschenen, wordt het vandaag al gezien als de beste biografie van de Beauvoir tot nu toe. Kate Kirkpatrick wordt vanavond geïnterviewd door Eveline Groot. Eveline is zelf freelance filosoof en doctoreert over de filosofische implicaties van het politieke werk van Madame de Staël. Hierbij wil ik ook nog eventjes vermelden dat degenen die het boek nog niet gelezen hebben, maar wel interesse hebben, ter gelegenheid van Nacht van de Vrijdenker 2020 biedt boekhandel Walry in Gent de biografie Simone de Beauvoir, een leven, aan met 10% korting en dat tot het einde van de maand, dus tot 30 november. Haar boek kan je dus onmiddellijk na deze avond bestellen op hun gloednieuwe webshop van boekhandel Walry of natuurlijk in de winkel zelf kopen, aangezien boekhandels gelukkig maar als essentieel worden gezien en voorlopig nog open mogen blijven. Dan zal ik nu het woord geven aan Eveline and Kate Kirkpatrick. Are you both here?
Yes.
Hello. How are you?
Very good. Are you also here, Kate?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction, Yasmin. I think I don't have to introduce us anymore. But yeah, as you know, for the next 45-50 minutes, I will be interviewing Kate Kirkpatrick about this wonderful book. It's already been said, but it has been translated in 12 languages. It has been extremely successful. And just now, Kate, it was mentioned in Dutch that this biography might be the best one so far. So that was a huge compliment. Yeah, so Kate, you are here all the way from the UK. Are you now in Cambridge? Yeah,
and in Oxford. Yes,
in Oxford. Yeah. I'm sorry. Oh, I just
right.
Oxford.
Don't worry. No. Don't worry. I'm not territorial about these things.
Yeah, well, people usually are. So I made a horrible slip of the tongue there. But yeah, no, really awesome that you're here with us. And yeah, let me just start by, saying that I am very much also a fan of your biography. And the thing that I really admire about this biography is not that it is just another book about the Simone de Beauvoir as a person, about her life, but truly about her as a philosopher in her own right, not only as, the disciple of Sartre. But I do, before we dive into the philosophy of the Beauvoir, I do want to look at this mutual companionship, this intellectual relation that Sartre and the Beauvoir had, because that is what, for the general audience, is most commonly known about the Beauvoir. So in what way did their mutual relationship got shape, and how did they intellectually influence each other?
Okay, well, to answer that question, I suppose I'd like to ask you first, do you mean the legend of their relationship, or their relationship as unfolded historically?
Well, that's a good question. So you can interpret it in many ways. I prefer to stay away from the romantic part, but more like, okay, how did they work together? How did they encourage each other? How did they intellectually collaborate?
Yes, so I think this is the answer to that question depends on when in Beauvoir's life you're asking about. And the reason I asked you about whether we wanted to look at the legend of the relationship or the relationship as it unfolded historically is because I think that Beauvoir and Sartre met each other in 1929. They were both at the end of their formal studies of philosophy and taking the agrégation, Sartre for the second time. And I think from early on, they shared preoccupations and philosophical preoccupations. They shared a commitment to the philosophical power of literature. And I think they enjoyed discussions that ranged over multiple domains. So it ranged over what was an effective literary technique, but also over what kinds of positions were the strongest philosophical positions amongst their those that were debated by their contemporaries. And so I think the relationship changed quite a lot over time because of, you know, everyday factors like where they were living, whether they could spend time with each other regularly, whether they needed to rely on letters to communicate. So I think it changed a great deal. But the reason that I focus so much on the intellectual relationship in the biography is because even when Simone de Beauvoir had just met Sartre, and she was in the height of her euphoria at meeting this like-minded person, she said in her Cahiers de Jeunesse, her student diaries, that the most important thing about Sartre, that he did play a central role in her life, but it wasn't a central role, to quote her own words, in her body or her heart, because there many others could be, but that he was the incomparable friend of her thought. So I see the thing that she valued most about their relationship is this friendship of thinking, where they challenged each other, they disagreed, but they encouraged each other in their intellectual pursuits.
Yeah, so beautifully pointed out the idea that they are friends in their thought, and that is the most important part of their relation. And what is really interesting about the book, you read the whole development of de Beauvoir as a very young girl until, you know, later on in life when she reaches a very old age. And you kind of have a sense, like the book is called Becoming Beauvoir for a reason. She is developing throughout, and she is developing throughout her life also a lot because of the relationships she has with others, whether they are intellectual, romantic, friendships, or like family. She has good family bonds as well. And of course, you know, with Sartre, they also develop each other in their relationship. They kind of determine who they are. So I was wondering, in what way does this idea of being determined by a relation play a role in the philosophy of de Beauvoir? Is it, for example, is it a coincidence that she is looking for these people in her life and these relationships that are often very durable in order to develop herself?
I don't think it's a coincidence. So I think even in her Cahiers de Jeunesse, she's explicit about the kind of love that she wants in life. And I use the word love with the caveat that it's a word with multiple meanings. Obviously, it has the romantic and erotic senses, but it also has much broader senses. And Beauvoir is quite explicit about developing this kind of developmental role of love, that every human being seeks the affirmation of other human beings from childhood onwards. And she thinks it's a core part of the human being to desire to love and to be loved in multiple senses. And so I think she struggles with some of her expectations. So I mean, it's interesting in the Cahiers de Jeunesse that she's already aware of things like Spinoza's discussions of love and Leibniz's discussions of love, and the question of the relation between love and justice. And so I think it is quite intentional on her part. She has quite high ideals, and sometimes she fails to live up to those ideals, and sometimes other people fail to live up to those ideals. But they are pretty consistent in the written text that we have from the 20s and the 40s, at least, seems to me.
Yeah, and you mentioned the relation between justice and love. So there is also an ethical dimension to this type of love, right? Like is this type of love incorporated in her ethical theory?
Yes, yeah, I think so. You know, Beauvoir grew up in a Catholic household where one of the key ethical injunctions is that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so the command is twofold. You have to love yourself and you have to love your neighbor. And I think in the Cahiers de Jeunesse, she discusses explicitly two ways that love can fail. And it's quite Aristotelian in its formation. There's a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And she calls the vice of excess egoism, so in English it's egoism, or sometimes narcissism. So in the second sex she talks about narcissism more. And then the vice of deficiency is devotion. And the egoist is only concerned with loving themselves and what they get out of love. But it's also possible to fail to love properly by being devoted to someone else, and forgetting that your own moral worth is an important part of a love that's just. So I think you see it in the Cahiers de Jeunesse. She talks about le dévouement, that kind of devotion, in her philosophical essay Purus and Cineas.
Mm-hmm.
And then it comes back in the second sex. What I think is fascinating is that originally she formulates this as a theory, which is it's just a human theory. It's a philosophical theory. But many subsequent readers, in English at least, have read the second sex as a philosophical text, which is about women, instead of something that's applying claims about the relation of love and justice, which hold elsewhere to the particular case of women.
Yeah, and also in a reciprocal way, right? So it concerns both men and women, but she speaks from her own perspective. Can you say that? Yeah, can you say like that? So maybe take it a step further, because this notion of love and ethics is also connected to her ideas on freedom, right? Because she have relationships with other beings, and these beings, they act in life. Acting is a very important part of her ethics. Because they act, they also take away some of your free space to act, and the other way around. So how is this notion of freedom related to having all these relationships and to the ethics of the Beauvoir?
Yes. So I think that's a question that doesn't admit of a general answer. So I think each particular relationship in Beauvoir's case would have to be assessed with respect to her views of the time, if that's what you're trying to do, to figure out whether she lived coherently at that point in her life.
Mm-hmm. But maybe ideally, like
according to her ethics. Ideally, well, so I think she would object to the idea that there is an ideal answer. So I think part of it's a classic line now for feminists to take, that when we look at the theory of justice, what many philosophers are doing is ideal theory, instead of looking at the messy world in all its ambiguity. And so Beauvoir says, look, I'm not providing a picture of the ideal, because the ideal isn't achievable. So we do encroach on each other's freedom. And actually, there's one thing that maybe I'm not supposed to say this if people haven't read the book yet, but if there was something I could put in the book now, I would probably talk more about Beauvoir's relationship with Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty has a concept of encroachment, or empiètement in French, which concerns the way that freedoms come into contact with each other and limit each other in a way that is ethical. So there's some kinds of restrictions of other people's freedoms that are unethical. But when human beings interact with each other, there's certain kinds of limitations that seem to many, at least intuitively, to be ethical. And even the idea of the social contract is that you accept certain constraints on your freedom for the common good. And so Merleau-Ponty, it turns out, developed this idea of the encroachment of freedoms after reading Beauvoir's novel, The Blood of Others, Le sang des autres. And it's another case where in his notes for his lectures, he cites Beauvoir and talks about the novel, but in the versions that are published, she doesn't appear. So I think there are many cases with her interlocutors, and I'm not saying that this is malicious. Many people form their thoughts and then kind of take away the scaffolding that helps them build their perspective. But in Beauvoir's case, I think this happened a lot, and it's led us to underestimate her philosophical contributions to French existentialism and phenomenology. But to come back to your question about love, sorry,
no problem.
I'm not sure I quite answered your question, except to say that I don't think she says that you can achieve a kind of ideal situation, but what it means to be authentically in relationship with others means to fight for each other's freedom, and never to forget that in the context of a loving relationship, that both you and the other need to feature in right balance.
And so in relation to, you mentioned Merleau-Ponty, who was a very good friend of the Beauvoir, didn't give her specific credits, whether it is, done purposely or not. Probably not. That just often happens. The same is also often the case in her relation with Sartre, right? Because, for example, I read this commentary of Fulbrooks and Simons, who said that actually the notion of the self, of Sartre for me, being a nothingness, actually is derived from that Pires and Cineas, Pires and Cineas book that de Beauvoir wrote. So it happens a lot. And what would you agree with that commentary, that the notion of the self of Sartre is actually rooted in de Beauvoir's philosophy?
So I don't agree, and the reason is that I think both Beauvoir and Sartre were very influenced by the discussions that were current in French philosophy at that time. If you read someone like Gabriel Marcel, for example, he says that the first time that existentialism was put forward in France was in one of his essays in 1925, an essay called L'existence et l'objectivité. And so Beauvoir and Sartre made existentialism very famous, and they were talented writers, and they did advance isolatable theses of their own. But I'm not personally committed to the view that Sartre stole ideas from Beauvoir. And I think their relationship raises fascinating questions about intellectual property, but also about the generative power of relationships. So I've read pedagogical studies about philosophical friendships, because it seems to be the case that when undergraduate students who are studying philosophy form friendships with other students that are studying philosophy, so they start discussing philosophy outside of the seminar room, they perform so much better, because their thinking occurs in a context, the context of different kinds of relationship. And so to give you a short answer, I'm not agreed with the idea that Sartre stole Beauvoir's ideas. And I think the question of influence is a very interesting one to ask, because of the power of friendship, I think, in helping people explore the big questions of life.
And so the influence was really mutual, right? They spoke to each other almost, not every day, but through letters, through phone calls later on in life. They often met, even when they were far apart from each other. So there was a lot of collaboration and interaction, like you mentioned, rightfully. But what is interesting is that when you look, for example, at the historical reception, and you mentioned the obituaries in your introduction of your book, it's so shocking to see the contrast where, in the obituaries of Sartre, de Beauvoir is merely called for, like she's not mentioned that much at all. Whereas in the obituaries of de Beauvoir, she's called, I think, even a sex slave, right? Like a disciple, a student, a lover, wife, but it's very degrading. So I was wondering, while reading that, was there a point in time where de Beauvoir was perceived of as a thinker in her own right during her life? Like, did there shift something? Because I can imagine that, she had this very influential circle of friends surrounding her. She wrote a lot. She was an excellent teacher, an excellent philosophy student. So she had some credits. But when was she out of credit, so to say?
Yes, so I think that there's a dynamic that I think sometimes gets overplayed in the Anglophone scholarship on Simone de Beauvoir, which is to say that Beauvoir was never recognized as a philosopher. And I think that's overstating the matter. So if you look at the institute, the French Audiovisual Institute, INA, they have videos and radio programs where Beauvoir is introduced as a philosopher, or even France's first woman philosopher or greatest philosopher, woman philosopher. So she certainly was, you know, given that title in her lifetime. And so much of the kind of abuse that she suffered was polemical abuse, and it was often, you know, it was often politicized. So many Catholics thought she was terrible for women and for society, and they were not shy about adopting, you know, pretty harsh invective to attack her. But I found this fascinating because, you know, recent research into gender has found that when women achieve positions of authority or positions that are traditionally masculine coded, they're often subject to what are called social dominance penalties. So they're often taken down to size, or their traditional gender roles are reinforced by drawing attention to traditionally feminine things, or their failure to do traditionally feminine things. And we see this happen in Beauvoir's life quite a lot, where she's called Mademoiselle de Beauvoir, even as a mature woman, or she's told that she owes everything to Jean-Paul Sartre. And I think it was this that made me quite suspicious of the way that she was treated, because, you know, it's one of the central claims of the second sex that becoming a woman is often involves alienation from either from your body or from your projects, or from who you'd like to be, because you'll be accused of being a failure at being a woman if you're faithful to your own desires for your life. So I wanted to make sure to include that, because I think, you know, throughout her life, she faced those kinds of penalties. And I thought, you know, if it happens to her, what hope do the rest of us have? But anyway, yes.
But does she in the deuxième sex and the second sex also describe this dynamics of? She obviously talks about being the second sex, maybe raising beyond the limitations of your second sex, and then being alienated from that again?
Well, so she talks about in the second sex. I have a particular reading of the second sex, which is that she's reading it in the light of Nietzsche's revaluation of values. So her own life was shaped quite a lot by her loss of faith, and the question of how there can be values in a world without the transcendent value of God to root them. And I think that in the second sex, she's considering a lot of questions all at once. But with respect to this dynamic, she's speaking into the tradition of the question of genius. So people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche talk about genius. Schopenhauer says explicitly that women are, this is a direct quotation, the second sex in every respect inferior to the first. And he says that women can have talent, but not genius. And there's a section in the first volume of The Second Sex, which I think is often overlooked, where Beauvoir says, one is not born, but rather becomes a genius. And she's saying that women are not encouraged to have these kinds of projects for their lives. To be a genius is to be unfeminine. And, you know, to sacrifice the kinds of things that geniuses are allowed to sacrifice, like, I don't know, having a tidy house, or being organized, or doing your embroidery, or whatever the relevant things might be. This is going to mean failing to be feminine. And so she is, I think, asking this question: how is it that a woman who is a being in search of values in a world of values, that's one of the definitions she gives of a woman, can exist without being alienated from her own projects for the sake of femininity. So penalties are part of the picture. You know, this is, you'll be told you're not a woman, or you're the third sex or something else if you're not feminine in the way that French society expected women to be in 1949. But it's not the only part of the picture. Yeah, it's quite a complex book, not always a book that holds together well, in my opinion.
And you don't describe it necessarily as a feminist book, right? Yeah. It's more, the way you describe it, it is more a philosophical project that she's engaged with. So what do you think about this reading of the Beauvoir Second Sex as, you know, the biggest feminist book that there is?
Well, so I think it's worth noting that she was surprised by its reception. You know, she said she wrote it as a theoretical work, not as a practical political work. And but one of the things that I find fascinating about the reception of the Second Sex is that it wasn't until Beauvoir turned to life writing and through a explicitly political engagement with and two women, that readers returned to the Second Sex in numbers, and it took on this political importance. So the Second Sex was published in 1949. It was scandalous. It sold quite a bit then. But between 1949 and the publication of Beauvoir's first volume of memoirs, The Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, she received a lot of letters from her readers where they'd say things to her like, "This book is too important to write it in 1,000 pages of dense philosophical jargon. You know, it's why have you written this for the Paris literati?" And I think she took that to heart, and she says explicitly in some of the publication materials for The Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter that she's applied the theory of the Second Sex to her own life, but without the jargon of philosophy or psychoanalysis. And so I think the idea that that one's own life can articulate one's philosophical principles is something that you know, you see in her student diaries, but then you see in her turn to life writing in the 1950s as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it is particularly this like turn to life writing, as you name it. That is something that's hardly perceived of as doing philosophy, right? So also thinking about like the Beauvoir, she had a really interesting idea of what philosophy was and what doing philosophy was. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, certainly. Before I do that, I want to say that we don't think it's unphilosophical for Saint Augustine to use an autobiographical form, or Rousseau. You know, Rousseau's Confessions.
True.
So I think that yeah, I'll leave it at that. But so her conception of philosophy, I think you can see in different places. But one of the essays that I find most helpful for understanding what she's doing is an essay from the mid-1940s called Literature and Metaphysics. And she distinguishes in that essay between what she calls systems philosophers and subjectivity philosophers. And she includes in the category of systems philosophers people like Leibniz or Spinoza. And in the category of subjectivity philosophers, she talks about Kierkegaard and actually Dostoevsky. So she thinks that novelists can do philosophy and capture subjectivity well. And that view, I've said that I think it's well articulated in this essay from the 1940s, but you already find it in the 1920s in her Cahiers de Jeunesse, where she's discussing Bergson's Time and Free Will. So she read Bergson, and I think her concept of becoming is very much her conception is very much indebted to Bergson's idea that every human being is constantly in transition, and also to Bergson's theory of time. And Bergson discusses the way that novelists can kind of take the veil off of our conventional selves. And I think there's something about, when you read a novel, if you have access to a first-person point of view, even though it's a fictional first-person point of view, there's an imaginary experience, which Beauvoir says in literature and metaphysics. She makes a very strong claim. I'm not sure she means it, but that it can be as complete as a lived experience. If you read a metaphysical novel, which is not just any novel. And so her conception of philosophy is that there are multiple aims of philosophy, that systems philosophers have different aims than she had, and that she was concerned with subjectivity. And I think that her interest in human development and in psychoanalysis was also an important part of this. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to foreground the concept of love in the biography, because there's a long tradition in French philosophy, not just French, but if you look at someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, he says that love without justice is not virtue. And I think she wants to kind of say, look, that the supreme vocation that's been proposed to women is that your life is justified by love. But if there's no justice, is there really a justification? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. What I was thinking, so you mentioned a lot, but now I lost my thread. Let me get it back. Oh yeah, so you mentioned, so you mentioned that there, oh yeah, so the subjectivity philosophy, that's why I wanted to go back to. It is often like about the individual perspective, right? And the individual perspective, the subjective perspective. And you mentioned before that, there is no ideal ethics or ideal philosophy for the Beauvoir, and it probably holds together with this idea, right? That you are in a lot of transformational developmental states regarding your situatedness as well. And maybe also regarding the situatedness, I was wondering, could you regard the Beauvoir then as also an existentialist? Maybe not a system philosopher existentialist, but a subjectivity philosophy existentialist.
Yes, yeah, and I suppose it depends on whether you think that existentialism is a systematic philosophy, and this is a debate. This is a debate that is currently being reinvigorated, because there's another British philosopher, Jonathan Webber, who published a book in 2018 called Rethinking Existentialism, where he says that existentialism is, we shouldn't take a broad approach to defining existentialism. Because although there are themes in common between people like Kierkegaard and Camus and Sartre, Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty, there's a great deal of disagreement. And so he says what we need is a strict definition of existentialism. And the strict definition he offers is that it's a theory of value, which Beauvoir develops in Pyrrhus and Cineas, which says that freedom is the value that founds all of other values. So I think there are certainly systematic readings of Beauvoir. And I would say that she's an existentialist. She called herself an existentialist. But whether or not we should take existentialism to involve a commitment to a system is another question.
But you name her in your book the queen of existentialism. But often yes. if you talk about existentialism, she is left out of the picture. So what did she contribute solely the ethical side to existentialism, or was there more to it?
Well, so I've been thinking about this, and partly because I've been rereading the Cahiers de Jeunesse recently, and I think so many of the so-called Sartrean claims of existentialism she makes already in the 1920s. So, for example, the idea that the self of today can't make choices for the self of tomorrow. It's the idea of anxiety is a kind of existentialist cliche. You find it in Kierkegaard. but this is you find this idea in Beauvoir before Kierkegaard has been translated into France and before Sartre's talking about it. And I think that there are, so I think that the sort of temporality of the existentialist self is something that Beauvoir committed to, contributed to existentialism, and Sartre acknowledged that in a letter to her. He said that when he was reading L'Invité, She Came to Stay, the novel that was published in 1943, that he found a theory of time in her novel. And so I think she did contribute a lot to that. I think it is also the ethics. So she said when she published Pyrrhus and Cineas, this essay that she wrote in 1943 and published in 1944, that existentialism did not imply an ethics, and that for her part, she was trying to give existentialism an ethics. So I think that's the most explicit claim we have on her part as to what she contributed to existentialism. But I think there are probably many other concepts, that you could include, and the other problem that she claimed was her problem, in the way that philosophers can be territorial about problems, was the problem of the relation of the self and the other, and that's quite explicitly formulated in the Cahiers. It's where she wants to understand the relation of self and other, and her need for others, and her desire for others, and the conflict that seems to arise from the desire to be loved and the desire to love, and the failures that can result from both of these things.
Yeah, and then it's also interesting in regard to the idea that what you said about time, that the self that you were yesterday is not the self that you are today, or the self that you will be tomorrow. So, how to maintain those relationships, how to also hold responsibility maybe for your acts. And obviously no one is without any flaws, and the Beauvoir definitely made some mistakes. How does she look at those mistakes that she made in life in respect to others? For example, you have these passages in your book about involvement with very young students, which are probably against her own idea about love and justice and responsibility. So how did she deals with that? There seems to be friction between certain principles she does hold and then life experience.
Yeah, so I think that this is where it gets very important to make sure that the claims are temporally located, because in the 1930s, she seems to have drifted away from her confidence in herself as a philosopher and as a writer. She seems to have prioritized Sartre's career to an extraordinary degree. And it's fascinating that she was reading things like, she was reading Husserl in the early 30s when Sartre was working on his phenomenological pieces. It's speculation what role she played in the writing of those works of Sartre. It seems that it's not at all speculation that her German was much better than his German. And so she probably played some role. So I think in the 30s, she fell away from it. It seems plausible. I'm not going to say that she definitely did, but it seems plausible that she kind of lost her convictions in that period. And but also that she learned through experience the kind of person she didn't want to be. And so I think she didn't always know going into the relationships the kind of effects that they would have. And again, I want to be specific to each particular relationship because Beauvoir is quite a particularist. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about her as a person is that she's constantly reflective. And so you can see in her diaries and in her letters, if she thinks that she's failed, she will subject her failure to reflection. And I think we see a little bit of that in the material that's available publicly with respect to her relationships to students. But I also think it's the case that the context was very different from the present context. And so she might not think that she failed for reasons that present readers would take her to have failed.
Yeah, and it also allowed her, of course, to develop and to change opinion and to develop her own thought and thinking. And the Beauvoir, you quite beautifully made clear throughout this interview that you cannot really separate the Beauvoir as a person and the Beauvoir as a philosophical thinker. It seems to be impossible. And this becomes also beautifully clear from the sort of themes that she attacks through life. So we already thought about like her early work, about the second sex. And what I was really fascinated about, because I didn't know that much about it, is that she writes a lot about old age. So she found it really difficult to grow older. And in what way does she tackle a theme like that? So she's getting older, she's confronted with a lot of problems that are concerned with being an elderly woman. So how does it come about in her work? How does she tackle a topic like that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I think that watching her mother die was part of it, because her mother died before she wrote the book on old age, and so she confronted human vulnerability, and there's a beautiful passage in A Very Easy Death, the memoir that she wrote about her mother's death, where she describes looking at the body that she loved as a child, and seeing this aged body, which was still the body that she loved as a child, but which was failing her mother. And I think so there are multiple personal experiences, including her own first person experience of aging, that contributed to her desire to write that book. But the methodology was, I'm going to say, eclectic. She was a friend of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was the founder of structural anthropology, and he gave her access to a library where she could read gerontocratic manuals. So she read medical treatments of old age, and there's it's similar to the second sex in that she wants to ask the question. This is again a theme that she already has in her Cahiers de Jeunesse. She wants to ask the question: what is old age from without, from the point of view of the observer, and what is old age as experienced from within? And so she relied on medical manuals, on sociological and anthropological studies, but also on the testimony of people who had grown old. But by this time in Beauvoir's career, she had become more Marxist, and she came to the conclusion that people, even if you're willing to ignore the oppression of women, the oppression that affects roughly half of the population, everyone who is fortunate enough to live a long life will experience the marginalization of age. And she says that in capitalist societies, the children and the elderly are sort of kept out of the political priorities because they are, quote, not yet or no longer men. To count as a citizen, you have to be an economically productive man, and you become redundant in old age. And so she asked the question, what must life be for people to be human in their old age? And she says that societies should pay livable pensions, and that they should remember that every human being, whatever their age, desires reciprocal relations. They still need the positive approbation of other human beings. And if you take that away from them, then you're not treating them in her understanding as human. And I think it's a really fascinating book because she also brings in her theory of time. She still has this Bergsonian picture of temporality. And on Bergson's understanding, human memory is not linear. It's more like conical. And so I think this is an interesting point. I know I've been saying a lot, so I'm going to say it briefly and then I'll stop. But on Bergson's understanding, you don't just have a memory here at time 1, and then another memory at time 2, and another memory at time 3. Time 1 then informs later memories in a conical sense. And so just like if you hear a refrain from a piece of music, the second time you hear it repeated, the memory of the first time informs the repetition. And so she talks a lot about memory in the book about old age, and the ways that in later life, people's memories come to play a more significant role, because their futures are shorter. Anyway.
No, but it's beautiful that the way you describe it, the book about old age. It seems to me just as revolutionary than the second sex in regards to the notion of reciprocity. Maybe as a takeaway question, how revolutionary was the philosophy of the Beauvoir?
I don't know. What does it mean to be revolutionary?
Or yeah. New, or new,
how
refreshing.
Yeah. Well, I think it was very new, because I think, in the 1940s, especially in some parts of the second sex, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty are widely said to have broken new ground in Western philosophy with their phenomenologies of the body. And Beauvoir comes and she says, well, hold on a minute. When you say the body, whose body do you mean? It's what about people for whom, so Merleau-Ponty talks a lot about the body subject and the idea that you are your body. And Beauvoir discussed the experience of adolescence for many women involving a feeling of alienation from their bodies because of the sexual objectification of men. And I think the experiences that she described were not new, but the philosophical terminology with which she articulated her points of view were very powerful. So, and I think they still are. In fact, there's a British sociologist who's recently been advising the UK government on their sexual harassment policy using a Beauvoirian framework. So it continues to be relevant.
Well, thank you very much, Kate. I think we will go to the questions from the audience now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jasmine, can you take away the questions from the audience?
Yes. Thank you, both of you. It was really interesting. Okay, we have a first question already. So as everybody else, you can put the questions in the chat box if you don't know how to do that. So first question, how would de Beauvoir look at contemporary or intersectional feminism? Certainly because her views of becoming, being in transition, doesn't intersectionality, pin people on fixed identities?
Yes, so I suppose it depends. So Beauvoir is not going, as I read her, Beauvoir is going to be skeptical about identity claims for metaphysical reasons. So, existentialists reject the idea of a fixed personal identity. So that might be a reason to reject if you think that intersectionality commits you to having a fixed personal identity, then there's going to be an incompatibility. Now, different conceptions of intersectionality, though, I think are more or less similar to what Beauvoir wants to say. So I think Beauvoir, because she has a conception of what she calls the situation, she says that every person's situation is different, and there's an extent to which that situation is irreducible. And so there's some similarities between her position and the claims of certain intersectional theorists that one's position is irreducible. But I'll just leave it to be brief. She's going to be skeptical about identity claims because we don't have a fixed personal identity.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Thank you for your answer. Then there is another question: if there has been a women philosopher since the Beauvoir in the 21st century. I think I can answer that for myself, since we already have two of them right now in our Zoom meeting, and somebody else also suggests the work of Hannah Arendt. And there are lots of other female philosophers. Just Google them or go to the library.
Can I make a little plug? So there's some young women in the UK who have just edited a book called The Philosopher Queens, which includes, oh, you got it, excellent. So I recommend that if they're ancient philosophers, and well, the whole spectrum of them, and not just European either. So that's worth a look if you're interested.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other people? I see another question coming up. Which lessons would you like to give us after studying Simone de Beauvoir so intensively? He also apologized for not yet reading your book.
You don't have to apologize for that. What lessons? Well, I think one of the things I've learned since writing this book is that Beauvoir speaks to people about very different things. So I don't want to be prescriptive about what we should learn from Simone de Beauvoir. I think, I did actually give a short answer to this in the conclusion of my book, but since you haven't read it and possibly other people haven't, I won't repeat myself.
No spoilers.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Other people are also commenting female philosophers they like in the chat, so that's really nice. Everybody keep on sharing. Are there other people questions? We still have 7 minutes left if we keep our timings right. So you can put them in the chat, then I'll just reply in Dutch. I switch to Dutch again to say that your book, Kate, is at a discount in our local bookstore here in Ghent. Dus nog eens bij iedereen de gelegenheid van Nacht van de Vrijdenker biedt Boekhandel Walrie 10% korting op het boek. Dus als je nu heel geïntrigeerd bent door wat Kate Kirkpatrick hier net allemaal verteld heeft, dan raad ik je zeker aan om het boek te kopen. Dus 10% korting tot eind november. En ik zie dat er niet direct ook andere vragen zijn. Er komt nog een vraag binnen. Oké. Kate, there's another question. Which book of Simone de Beauvoir would you recommend to read first as a new reader to her?
A new reader. So that depends on whether you would like a novel or a work of philosophy. So I think her essay, Purus et Cineas, is a really interesting work of philosophy. So that would be my place to start. She starts with the question, why should we do anything rather than nothing? Is there an answer to the nihilist? Yeah, so that's a good one. And then in terms of the novels, I think I really like her novel, All Men Are Mortal, Tous les hommes sont mortels, because it raises the question of the meaning of mortality and whether or not whether we should desire immortality, or whether in fact death gives meaning to life. So those are two of them. There's also the one that just came out, Les Inséparables, but that's only out in French so far, but it's good.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Belgium is a bilingual country.
Indeed, yes.
Not that I can read French very good myself, but it's a good practice anyhow. I also get questions about the discount of your book in my direct messages through Zoom. So yes, you can send me direct messages, but I will repeat them. Nee, de korting in Boekhandel Walrie geldt voor iedereen, dus niet enkel voor de mensen die vanavond deelnemen. En je kan zowel via de gloednieuwe webshop van Boekhandel Walrie, gewoon eens googlen, als gewoon in de winkel zelf bestellen. Okay, I think those are the questions. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Kate, for joining us tonight, and thank you, Eveline, for the interesting interview. And thank you, everybody. Bedankt iedereen om hier vanavond te zijn. Het is helemaal corona-proof kunnen verlopen, alleszins. Ik zat in mijn eigen bubbel en jullie zien er ook allemaal heel gelukkig uit. Het is leuk om allemaal gezichten te zien. En ik ben heel blij persoonlijk dat we dit samen toch hebben kunnen doen. In een verkorte versie, maar toch niet minder onaangenaam of zo. Nee, dus ja, bedankt iedereen dat jullie er waren. Als er... Deze opname gaat dus ook beschikbaar worden voor de mensen die een ticket gekocht hebben. Dan zullen we maandag of dinsdag naar jullie doorsturen. Zodat jullie kunnen herbekijken of mensen die stukjes gemist hebben of willen opnieuw bekijken. Dat is dus allemaal mogelijk. En dan nog juist over dus het boek Simone de Beauvoir, Een leven, dus met 10% korting bij boekhandel Welriet te verkrijgen. En de andere 2 boeken, want ja hoor, zij hebben ook boeken geschreven, van Hugo Mercier, Not Born Yesterday, of het boek van John Sellers, Lessons in Stoicism, die worden binnenkort verwacht in de boekhandel. Die zijn momenteel even niet verkrijgbaar. We kunnen het op corona steken, maar die worden dus binnenkort verwacht. Oké, dan denk ik dat ik deze avond mag afsluiten. Dank iedereen om hier te zijn. En volgend jaar hebben we ook al een datum voor Nacht van de Vrijdenker. Dus dat is op 20 november, als ik me niet vergis. 20 november volgend jaar. Hopelijk allemaal terug samen in de Vooruit.